Good morning and welcome to my presentation at the Society for Social and Conceptual Issues in Astrobiology. It's great to be with you today, even if virtually. My name is Douglas Estes, and I am the Associate Professor of New Testament and Practical Theology at South University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how to talk to aliens, or the assertive and interrogative divide in METI. When humanity speaks to aliens, what should we say? Previous attempts to communicate with intelligent extraterrestrials have taken on two general forms: visual messages in physical form, such as plaques, like in Pioneer 10, 1972, and Pioneer 11, 1973, as well as electromagnetic messages from radio telescopes, such as their Arecibo message in 1974, or the recent broadcast by METI International. Astrobiologist Charles Cockle explains that the distances and limitations in interstellar communication, quote, makes it impractical as a genuine attempt to start a conversation. And we know that, but without dismissing the obvious practical limitations that humanity faces at present in our attempt to communicate with ETIs, there are additional factors we should consider as we try to make genuine attempts at contact. Although previous attempts to contact ETIs have taken on two different forms, with some variation among those forms, there is one aspect of these communications that is similar. Each of these previous attempts were, from a linguistic perspective, assertions. The messages that we have sent to ETIs are statements. We assert that we can count to 10. We assert that we understand hydrogen chemistry. We assert that we live in a heliocentric solar system. What if assertions, though, are not the best approach? What if we need a different strategy to strike up a conversation? Now, on Earth, there are, and I'm speaking generally here, two forms of vocal communication: languages and calls. Now, having said that, I recognize there are going to be arguments against this perspective, and that's something that we can get into in the more fine tuning of the details. But whereas language is a type of communication that humans use, a call is a type of communication that other non-human species, at least those with the ability to vocalize, use. Evidence suggests that the only organisms on Earth with language are humans. So as we see, humans can use language, and our animal friends like humpback whales, Donkey Kong, and birds use what we call calls, a different type of vocalization. So evidence suggests that the only organisms on Earth with language are humans. But what is language? The noted linguist John Lyons likens a linguist trying to define language as a biologist trying to define life, so much that any definition of life and language will be tied up in the theoretical framework that the researcher uses to determine their definition. While an exhaustive definition of language is beyond the scope of this paper, the one differentiation that we can make is between a language and a call. Both are forms of communication, but organisms that use calls instead of language do so out of an instinctual response to environmental stimuli. While linguists and callists have noted the primary differences between language and calls, there is one difference that is often omitted from the general list, which is this: that language allows for the use of interrogatives, whereas calls do not. Put more simply, based on available evidence, animals do not ask questions. Thus, when non-human organisms communicate, they communicate through calls in such a way as to mimic what in human language are essentially assertions. For example, primates such as gorillas can learn sign language and can respond to what humans identify as questions, such as, "Are you hungry?" They can assert things such as "hungry" through calls that mimic human language, but they cannot actually ask a question: "Are you hungry?" The gorilla cannot ask me if I am hungry, even though I can ask him if he is hungry. So this brief overview reveals a concern about our attempts to contact ETIs. If non-human organisms that lack language skills are able to mimic assertions through their use of calls, Is it possible that ETIs who hear our message will confuse our message with calls instead of language? Or put another way, if humans broadcast unrelated and seemingly random assertions, is it possible that a superior intelligence who hears these messages will consider them calls of an inferior species rather than the actual attempts at peer-to-peer communication? On Earth, humans are surrounded by the calls of thousands of species from which only the rare human specialist attempts to understand. When these specialists try to understand, more time is allotted to primates than reptiles. If ETIs are receiving thousands of contacts from nearby species, they may privilege the most language like contacts over contacts that resemble calls. Perhaps most significantly, on Earth, calls are almost always intraspecies. If ETIs perceive our messages as calls, they may not feel that they are the intended recipients. Now, the objection to this argument will be that non-human organisms who make calls could never understand math or science. For example, the map of our solar system that exists on the Pioneer 10 plaque. However, I still feel that there is a bit of a weakness in this argument, at least in the time of the existence of species, which is this: that if a non-human life can evolve to mimic increasingly complex calls, these calls may increasingly resemble advanced intelligence. Now, in saying this, I'm not suggesting that a species without language abilities could evolve to create interstellar technology. But I am suggesting that an advanced ETI may perceive our previous attempts at contact as little more than calls from a significantly inferior species, one that would not be worth responding to, much in the same way that humans do not think to respond to the calls of most animals. So, as a simple example is that we, as humans, we hear the calls of other species on our own planet all the time. We just go outside and we hear those calls, but we don't think to respond to them, and there's no interest in us responding to them for the most part because they are not meant for us, and their ability to communicate to us is extremely limited, and we may even perceive as not being useful. So, in contrast to this strategy, I wonder if future attempts to contact ETIs should include other forms of language use. If so, chief among them should be an attempt to use interrogatives in our contact attempts. Since previous attempts at contact are essentially assertions, and even though they are varied, they could still be received as a type of call rather than an attempt at genuine dialogue. A future use of questions along with assertions could indicate that our communication is not limited to call-like utterances and is in fact intended for dialogue. Now, to make this argument, though, it brings up at least three concerns. The first concern is this: although previous attempts at contact with ETIs have largely involved call-like assertions, the limits of current technology result in many attempts being limited to signals and binary pulses. For example, the Arecibo message or the Russian Morse code message from 1962. In short, the limitations of this technology do not seem conducive to more than call-like assertions at this point. However, future technologies, for example, the breakthrough Starshot, could allow for both physical and near-planetary transmission strategies where more complex language utilization could come into play. However, all of this reveals another major conundrum. If language is a higher form of communication than calls, how does one use language with ETIs when it seems very unlikely that ETIs would be able to understand human language? Or put another way, in order to show intelligence to ETIs, we need to use language and not calls. And the ability to ask questions shows both intelligence and language skills. Yet while a call may be understood by an ETI, language use may not, or at least the threshold for understanding would be much significantly greater. Even this assumes that ETIs evolved on a planet which positively encouraged vocal expression. Now, the sociolinguist Harvey Sarles, in his foundational essay, Could a Non-Human, suggests that there is little optimism to believe that non-humans, whether of this world or another, could ever understand human language. since human language is more than mere vocalization or words, but is a complex physical, social, psychological enterprise. And in fact, for humans to ask questions relies on many more communicative cues than merely making statements. Although ETIs may not be able to understand the meaning of our communication, the advanced question asking posture may signal more complex thought processes to listening ETI exologists. Second, if it were possible to pose questions rather than or alongside of assertions, this may raise the likelihood of response. We have already established that language signals something that calls do not, but questions signal something that assertions do not: the willingness, but also the need for dialogue. Whenever someone asks a question, whether a question with high informational qualities or high rhetorical qualities, this question asking always admits a lack or a need that is not present in the making of the assertion. This is a part of what linguists call the erotetic logic of questions, as opposed to the assertive logic of statements. From a human psychological perspective, the admission of need tends to spur a greater response than simply a statement. Although we cannot know the psychology of an ETI listener, any successful admission of a lack or a need on our part could spur a greater response to our questions. Third, the most difficult challenge this discussion presents is how humanity might indicate an interrogative posture alongside assertions in our attempts at communication with ETIs. As noted, the possibility of an ETI understanding human language is, by our present expectations, extremely poor. By the way, this is where a deus ex machina from science fiction comes in handy, right? Such as ETIs who happen to have an all-powerful AI that can decipher any language or have universal telepathy. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But this all is further complicated because questions require a greater degree of language comprehension than statements. Human languages can utilize up to 8 different linguistic tells to indicate that an utterance is a question. And of course, that would be multiplied when we're dealing with non-human languages. These tells run the gamut from prosody to punctuation. If we consider historical linguistics as an example, it is difficult for modern linguists to determine whether a written utterance in an ancient text is a question or a statement. And these are human linguists studying human languages. The challenge for exolinguists is infinitely steeper. In contrast, all human languages utilize questions, and there's a great deal of linguistic similarity between questions among human language families. As with assertions, we may begin to think about asking questions in pre-contact scenarios. Although there will be a great temptation to think about what we ask or semantics, I suggest more time be spent on how we ask, the syntax and the pragmatics. For example, among Indo-European languages, there are essentially 4 forms that a question may take. It may be advisable to ask questions that are highly information-seeking and open in their approach. But pragmatically, some information-seeking and open questions are also what we call more face-threatening. It may be advisable to ask questions that do not require any admission on the part of the responder. And as a classic science fiction trope, any language that involves phatic, meaning socially determined aspects, should be avoided at all costs. If it were possible for an advanced ETI's AI to decipher our language, it seems the potential becomes greater in written or transcript form than vocalized. Final thoughts. In this essay, I've shown a few of the promises and perils of integrating questions in with assertions in future attempts to contact ETIs. Notwithstanding the perils, it seems the reward, if we are serious about contact, would outweigh the risks. It will signal to interested ETIs that we are not merely making calls to those of our own species. It may suggest that not only do we have language skills, but we have complex language skills that allow us to engage in shared work. Finally, it may suggest that we want to dialogue rather than simply monologue with our friends in another part of the cosmos. Thank you for listening.